I'm Mary Victoria Dombrowski, and this is War and Magic. War and Magic is a multi-part series which explores the secret behind the 1942 evacuation and relocation of the ethnic Japanese. My guest today is someone whom I have long hoped to meet. He is the editor and publisher of a book published in the year 2000, which for the American public broke the story, the cover story of racism, which up to then had hung over the evacuation and relocation. This book revealed the top secret code breaking behind FDR's decision. The book is a book with quite a long title. It's called Magic, the Untold Story of U.S. Intelligence and the Evacuation of Japanese Residents from the West Coast during World War II. Its author is David D. Lowman, and my guest today is the book's editor and publisher, Lee Allen. Welcome, Lee.
Thank you, Mary. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you. Lee, I know that your home is in Utah and you're up here in the Northwest, the beautiful Pacific Northwest, visiting and touring. And I want to thank you for making this time to stop on Bainbridge Island and to speak to the audiences of War and Magic. I have a great many things I'd like to ask you, and I'd like to start by asking you about the publication of the book itself. There was an earlier guest on War and Magic, Bill Kubik, who sadly has recently passed away. And the audiences of War and Magic heard Mr. Kubik speak about his association with David Lowman and gave us his impressions of how Mr. Lowman's book came to be published. So, since you are the editor and publisher, I'd like you to tell our audience the real story of how this book came to be published.
I'd be happy to. In late 1999, I first got wind that David Lowman had written a manuscript. And I wasn't sure where it was or even if it still existed. I made a trip up to Seattle and visited with Keith Robar and his wife Tanny, and Bill Kubik met with us there. And at that time, Keith told me he thought that the book, or the manuscript, had been placed in the Hoover Institution at Stanford in a grouping of records that David Lowman had bequeathed to the institution. I then contacted the Hoover Institution, and they were quite excited that somebody was interested in this particular book. Part of their business is to try and get people to publish material that they have. They have a great archive there. It used to be War, Peace, and Revolution was their field. I guess it still is. I had to first qualify with the Hoover Institution as to being capable and qualified to do justice to the book. And then I had to get Eleanor Lowman, David Lowman's wife's permission, which she kindly granted, and we established a good working relationship with her. Then my son and I started work on the book, and it required a lot more than the normal amount of editing, because all of the resources had to be checked, first obtained and then checked, and then there were several voids that needed to be filled. We supplemented it with photographs, which we obtained from the National Archives, and then we also got a number of very important documents that I had already obtained from the FBI. We got more from the National Archives, and so when the book came out, it had several sections that weren't in the original manuscript that complemented the work that Lowman had done. I found a benefactor to sponsor the publication of it. We had our release and sent review copies out to about 250 different organizations. We received reviews on about a dozen, including the Los Angeles Times, which gave a very interesting review that indicated that this material was certainly important, but they chose not to believe it. They believed that all these statements that came directly from the Japanese government were indeed puffery, as the Committee on Wartime Relocation had claimed earlier. This book is a very serendipitous effort, because it wouldn't be possible nowadays, short of maybe 20 years of work and a great deal of expenditure, to obtain the resources that Lowman obtained. What happened was that when the report from the Commission on Wartime Relocation and Internment of Civilians came out, Lowman wrote a op-ed piece for the New York Times based on the work that he had done declassifying magic documents in the late 70s. And this sort of started the ball rolling. And when the court cases came up, Lowman was retained by the government to act as a consultant in the material. And that gave him unprecedented access to the files of the Office of Naval Intelligence, the Military Intelligence Division, the FBI, and others. If you had to do that today under the Freedom of Information Act, it would take you years.
Well, I'm curious, when you got the manuscript, what did it physically look like? Was it handwritten, typed?
It was a typed manuscript. I had to buy it by the page from the Hoover Institution. It cost about $120, $140.
So they kept and still have the original? And
they had the original, and I paid for a copy. It was a typed manuscript. I guess it was about that thick. It was obviously a draft of work that he was intending to do. And in some cases, the referenced reports and things were there. In other cases, we had to dig them up. But he had struggled with this issue ever since that op-ed piece in the New York Times. And it was my understanding that he and his wife had lived in Hawaii for some time, and that he had suffered a lot of abuse and shunning by some of the local folks out there for the work that he had done on this. They just weren't interested in hearing what the truth was. And he contracted a very serious nerve disorder in the last years of his life. His wife, Eleanor, herself a very intelligent and scholarly person, had gathered the papers together and had taken care of his material, and was helpful when we produced the book.
We are sitting here today on December 6th, and we're one day shy of the 65th anniversary of Pearl Harbor. And the location where we are here on Bainbridge Island would have been, at that time, 65 years ago, part of top secret Station S, where U.S. Navy codebreakers were intercepting messages being sent by the Japanese. And I'm wondering if you could talk about the importance of stations like Fort Ward, Station S, during World War II.
The field of cryptology and the field of signals intelligence, in other words, obtaining information from your enemy by decrypting his signals and messages, was really getting started about this time. Herbert Yardley had done some good work in World War I, and a great deal of benefit was gained from breaking a Japanese code during the Washington Naval Conference in the 20s. But things were really going as World War II started. What caused this to happen was that in the late 30s, the Japanese diplomatic code was codenamed or cover named the Red Code, Code Red. And they changed to a purple code, which is a more sophisticated code. And they used a very sophisticated electrical machine to encode and decode these messages. We had a small group in the Army Signals Intelligence group. You might just hold up the back of the book. That's their picture there. I don't know if that can be brought in. But these folks had broken the red code, but when the Japanese switched to the purple code, they had to start all over again. And fortunately, some operator somewhere, and this is the way it often happens, sent the same message in both codes. And so it was sort of like the Rosetta Stone. They could read the one and then see how the second one fit in. And so they broke the purple code. And then, through a great deal of hard work, and I'm sure luck, they came up with an analog to the machine that the Japanese used to encode their messages. In other words, they built a machine that would do exactly the same thing the Japanese would do. And this allowed them then from September 30th, 1940 on to read the Japanese highest diplomatic codes. Now, of course, work was going on in other areas all the time, trying to break other codes, and we're familiar with the Japanese code breaking that resulted in the victory at Midway. The Station S here in Bainbridge was important for the very same reason, because we needed to pick it up, and this covered a certain area, the Pacific area, the Pacific region. And so it was a absolutely vital resource to the American and Allied war effort in the Pacific and in Europe.
Well, anyone who spent more than a little time on Bainbridge would know that what's very popular here now is to think of Bainbridge's identity as being the place from which Japanese Americans and Japanese were first evacuated in March of 1942. So I'm wondering, to me, you can't get one part of the story without the other. You've got Fort Worth at the south end, you've got the relocation of the Japanese. How do you see these two parts of the story fade together?
Well, I think the thing that's lost in the popular view of this whole situation is that we were at war. And it was a real war. Everybody was brought into it. It had been raging in China for years, since 1937. It had been raging in Europe. The world was caught up in war, and with the bombing of Pearl Harbor, we were in the middle of it, whether we liked it or not. In that regard, the movement of people from various places seems quite logical to me if you have security issues that are involved. It's my understanding that there were about 274 residents of Japanese ancestry here on Bainbridge Island. In some of the figures I've seen, there were about 83 who were citizens of Japan. In other words, they were not American citizens born here or naturalized. Now, the critics would say, well, they should have been. Well, the fact of the matter was they weren't. And in the magic book there, which we obtained from the resource that we obtained it from was the Department of Defense magic background of Pearl Harbor. We had been intercepting messages from the Seattle consulate for several months, maybe 10 months or so, about ship movements and about various planning activities here in the Seattle area. And of course, Bremerton was a major naval base. You had Station S here, intercepting the Japanese messages. This was a critical area, and they were already sending information out about what was going on. And when war came, it became necessary to move it out. Was it fair? No. And I have to tell you, war isn't fair. Were most of those people innocent? Sure, the vast majority were innocent. But how do you know who is there doing those reports? And the object, of course, was to set up a system that would be effective during the entire war. And the only easy, clean, and I think humane way to handle this thing was to move the people off. Other people were moved around or off Bainbridge Island for the very same reason. Once you have a security establishment somewhere, there are certain areas around it that need to be cleared, depending on what the risks are. And so the main thing is to remember there was a war, and to remember that we had already been receiving intelligence reports coming from the Seattle area, which more than likely came from Bainbridge because of its geographic location.
Yes, you had mentioned earlier that your vocation is as a geographer, and you had some comments about the geographical location of Bainbridge.
Well, I was an Army officer, and I studied, got a master's degree in geography at the University of Illinois. I taught at West Point for 3 years, but you don't have to be a geographer, and you don't have to be a rocket scientist to look at a map of Seattle Harbor and see that Bainbridge Island sits right in the center of the naval activity. Anything coming out of Bremerton either has to move around the north point of Bainbridge or it has to go around the south. And the kinds of reports that are in the magic book and that were in the intercepts had to do with the movement of ships in and out of that area. So it's a very important strategic location regarding the shipment of materiel and the movement of warships.
When you had mentioned earlier, just a few moments ago, about the relocation for security reasons of individuals, what that brought to mind for me immediately was that Fort Worth had been an Army base. And then in 1939, the Navy came and said, wait, this is an excellent location for a listening post. And so all the Swedish immigrants who were living right here were moved off, lost their homes, given 30, 60 days, something like that, to get out. And the Navy set up their antenna fields and...
Yeah, that happens. That happens all the time. It's still happening. When a requirement, a security requirement is established, and there's a need for land or various space, that's the way it's done. And it wasn't quite the same way it was done with the Japanese because it was an ethnic issue. But then again, we were at war with Japan. And the idea that war is somehow a civil rights activity is the purview of those people who don't understand what war is. Everybody's civil rights suffer when the war comes.
Well, that's right. In fact, that leads me to ask you a question about your own World War II experience. I had recently had the opportunity to see this film. It's called Victims of Circumstance, and it's about the individuals, families, men, women, children who spent World War II at the Santo Tomas Interment Camp in the Philippines as prisoners of the Japanese. And I know this is part of your history, Lee, so can you speak to us about that?
I'd be happy to. I was born in the Philippines. My father was in the Philippine Scouts, which were Army units that were officered by American officers. And my mother was a physician in private practice in Manila. They were married while they were there. They met while they were there and were married. And then I was born in '38. it was clear to everybody that war was coming with Japan. And my father had had a heart condition that had been caused by a childhood disease he contracted at the age of 35, which occasionally happened in those days. And he was to be medically retired on the 30th of November of 41. And they wanted to send the dependents home in June of 41. And my mother, knowing that we would be leaving in December, said, can I stay? And the commanding general said, well, if war comes and you'll volunteer to be a contract surgeon for the Army, we'll let you stay. And so he was retired, and then on the 8th of December, which is the same day as the 7th here, Manila was attacked. We were in Baguio at Camp John Hay, and we were bombed. My father was re-entered the Army immediately and went off to Bataan. And my mother joined the Army as a contract surgeon. I think I'd like to say that she was one of the heroines of World War II. There's a tradition in the Army that if you have to retreat, you leave your wounded behind and you leave them in the care of one of your doctors, who was then captured with the wounded soldiers. And my mother played that role in Baguio. And she was left with 28 seriously wounded men when the Army withdrew and pulled into the Bataan Peninsula. She was 3 months pregnant at the time, and was able to save all of those folks. She was later awarded the Freedom Medal by Douglas MacArthur for her services. So she was quite a wonderful woman. We lived in Baguio for about 2 months, and then we were transferred to a place called Camp Holmes, which was about 20 miles away. And we stayed there until September of 43. My brother was born on July 4th, 1942, while we were in captivity. And my mother, who needed a cesarean delivery, insisted that it be done on July 4th. She thought that was a good way to celebrate the occasion and to celebrate her defiance of our subjugation. In 43, September 43, we moved to Santo Tomas, and we were there until the end of the war. And the story in that DVD is about that camp.
Well, we often hear the relocation centers referred to as concentration camps or prisons. And I'm wondering how your experience might have corresponded with, say, a little Japanese-American boy who was your same age and who was at Manzanar or Minidoka. What do you think?
Well, I find that the calling of these relocation centers concentration camps to be extremely offensive. I find it offensive because tremendous efforts were made on behalf of the people there to ensure that they had what was needed to live a very reasonable life under the circumstances. We didn't have it all that bad compared to the military people that were captured on Bataan. For example, my father was one of the first to die in Cabanatuan. There have been several movies and TV shows recently about the liberation of Cabanatuan. But they lost 2,600 people dead in the first 6 months there as a result of brutality and neglect, starvation and disease in the hands of incompetent Japanese and brutal Japanese. That's a concentration camp. That's a real concentration camp. We didn't have it nearly that bad, but we did have people who had their heads cut off. We did have people who were tortured. I, at one time, witnessed one of those circumstances. We did have starvation. We did have lots of difficulty with diseases. We did have an inability to buy food and that sort of thing. In the relocation centers, on the other hand, and the story that is told is never the full story. There's been an effort to meld the idea of internment with relocation. Now, they each have a very specific meaning, and they each had a very specific situation. Internment was something that was done with citizens of Japan only. And they were in places like Santa Fe, New Mexico, and Crystal City, Texas. And they were incarcerated for the period. They were allowed, if their family wanted to, come and have their family come and live with them. And they didn't live in plush housing, but they lived there with Germans. They lived there with Italians, and they lived a fairly good life. In the relocation centers, what's never mentioned is that after a certain period in which the loyalty could somehow be determined through oaths and that sort of thing, background checks, these people were free to leave. And by 1944, almost 40,000 had. Senator S.I. Hayakawa, who was a Japanese American, commented that by 1944, everyone who could speak English and work was gone. And so you had a lot of old people who couldn't speak English, and you had young people who were in school and had no way of being supported outside. In 1943, the War Relocation Authority established centers in about a dozen cities, trying to find work and find placement for these people from the relocation centers. And many left to do this work. 4,000, irrespective of their nationality, went to college from these relocation centers.
Well, Lee, I'd like to thank you so much for your time and for talking with our audience about these important issues from World War II. I'm Mary Victoria Dombrowski, and this is War and Magic. And we're here today with Lee Allen for the second part of our interview. Lee is the editor and publisher of Magic, the Untold Story, written by David D. Lowman. In 1980, a congressional commission was formed called the, help me here, Committee
on Wartime Relocation and Internment of Civilians,
which went about its work and then produced a report called Personal Justice Denied, which it delivered to Congress in '83. And out of all that activity, eventually in 1988, the Civil Liberties Act was passed, which gave $20,000 to each per head of anyone who'd been relocated or interned during World War II, and also provided millions of dollars for public education. Now, I understand from what you said to me off camera, Lee, that there were some individuals who said, no, I don't want the $20,000. And why do you think that was?
Well, I wondered if there had been anybody. I made an inquiry through my senator concerning how this thing played out after the Civil Liberties Act was passed. And I received back a letter from Bill Land Lee through my senator that said that approximately 29 individuals had declined to accept the $20,000. And I thought to myself, there are not many people in this country or in the world who would decline 20,000 tax-free dollars. And I'm sure that it was a protest to the finding and the implications of what it meant for the United States to accept the slanted views of the commission. I didn't follow up on it, but someday somebody might, and it would be an interesting thing.
And what is the report, Personal Justice Denied?
The committee or the commission, people like to tout it as a bipartisan group that traveled to 20 cities over 2 years and held 200 hearings and interviews and all the rest of that. When you use the word, and this is part of the general willingness to be inaccurate that not only the commission but those folks who tout its findings have, when you say bipartisan, it means, in its absolute terms, it means people on both sides of an issue. Mm-hmm. And what it means for these folks was that it means some were Republicans and some were Democrats. Now, you can be bipartisan in the sense that some are Republicans and some Democrats, but if you're not bipartisan in that some may be for and some are against this historical account of the relocation. And at least 5 of the 9 of these people were absolutely on record as being for this revisionist view. The commission was very shallow in my view. It didn't contain any intelligence experts. It was run by lawyers. The object of it and its format, I understand, was established or recommended by Daniel Inouye, the senator from Hawaii. And it's a very common procedure, is you establish a commission that comes up with the approved account of a certain thing. And then you develop, after that, you develop secondary sources to support that. And in the case of the commission, they established this Personal Justice Denied. And then, as part of the Civil Liberties Act, they $5 million was given to public education on the findings of the commission. Now, not on any other findings, not on any other research, not on any other facts, and they even established the vocabulary that was suitable if you wanted to get a grant. You had to call them concentration camps or prison camps. You weren't allowed to use relocation, you used internment. So they not only set the parameters of the discussion, but then funded people who would support that. And then after the civil liberties money ran out at the federal level, California started $1 million a year program. And that's been going on since 1996. And every year they spend $1 million sponsoring TV specials, sponsoring books, newspaper and magazine articles, quilting, whatever it might be, plays. All of this has to support the findings of that commission. You're not allowed to do anything else. We submitted the magic book, not very hopefully, but we submitted that with the idea. It says in their charter that they're interested in researching the background of this incident. So we said, here's some real information on the background. And they didn't, they wouldn't touch it with a 10-foot pole because it didn't comply with the findings of the commission.
And as I understand the findings of the commission, in sum, were that the relocation and internment were solely due to racism, war hysteria, and a failure of political leadership. That's right.
That's exactly right. They say in major part. And there was much more to it than that. And the security of the country was involved.
And that the report did not include information about magic code breaking, for example, or espionage nets.
Well, if I think it was about 500 pages in their final report, 10 pages had to do with intelligence. And in the magic, you'll see pictures in the back there where some of these same Japanese Americans who were educated in Japan are holding bonsai ceremonies and worshiping the emperor and having military activities in the Tule Lake Segregation Center. So there was an element that was there. And then they quote FBI. Well, they didn't bother to mention that the FBI had 500 people at the time and had no intelligence gathering, international intelligence gathering to speak of. And they completely ignored the military aspects, the Navy, the Army, and all of the signals intelligence. And they excused it by saying, well, it was puffery. They were saying that because this report said we have people watching the harbors, we have American citizens in aircraft plants for intelligence purposes, we have contacts in the U.S. Army to give us the information that we need. We have people on the Mexican border reporting on what goes through there. We have people looking at ships. It was just, this stuff is right there in black and white, and it was totally ignored. They said it was puffery.
And when you're saying, quoting, we have people in the Army or in Mexico or whatever, you're quoting from
the Japanese consul.
And you have translated cables here in the back of Magic.
There are 3 cables that are of particular importance. One was in January of '41, in which from Tokyo to the United States, which announced that we were going to change our efforts from propaganda to intelligence, and we want to set up an intelligence operation that will work in time of war if need be. And then there were 2 reports that were picked up, one from Seattle and one from Los Angeles. And these were reports on progress in setting these things up. And the most blatant one was from Los Angeles, but even in Seattle, they were talking about doing some of these things. So, there was no question why San Pedro and why Bainbridge Island were evacuated. They were the first 2 places to be evacuated.
And I've heard other researchers say that once that happened, once the relocation happened, that flow of information ceased.
Yeah, that's right. That's exactly right. And it wasn't a very exquisite solution to the problem, but it was a very effective solution to the problem.
Well, Lee, I know you've been very active all of your adult life in research and writing. And you were kind enough to give me a copy of something that you had written earlier. This is dated '01 and it's co-authored by Lee Allen and Sam Allen. I'll read the title: Critique of the Smithsonian Institution's Exhibition, quote, A More Perfect Union, Japanese Americans and the U.S. Constitution. Lee, what's this?
That is the result of not being able to take it anymore. I had seen that exhibition when it first came out. It came out as part of the 200th anniversary of the Constitution. And then I had seen it several times since, and I said, somebody has to do something about this. It's that bad.
And when you say do something about this, what are you talking about?
Well, after the Commission's report was published, and after the Civil Liberties Act was passed, some government agencies, one of whom was the Smithsonian, picked up on the results of that commission and set up an exhibition to propagate it. And, you know, they're very good at the Smithsonian putting these exhibitions together, but they just didn't get it right. They omitted stuff, they exaggerated stuff, they made up stuff, and I'm not talking about small things. I'm talking about outrageous fabrications. The result of it was that they finally had to admit factual errors in regards to accomplishments and medals. Mm-hmm. They didn't even touch the other part of it. And but they did one of the things that we turned up. And people will have a hard time believing this. But that exhibit at the Smithsonian was in part funded by a Japanese Class A war criminal. Now, this is the National Museum of American History. What are we doing taking money from a Japanese war criminal, Ryuichi Sasakawa, to put on a exhibition that trashes the country? They've since taken the plaque honoring his donation off the wall and closed the exhibit, I understand. And
if people would like to read your critique, is this available anywhere?
If you go to athenapressinc.com/Smithsonian, you can read the whole critique and the Smithsonian response to it.
People who were living on the West Coast in Seattle, Bainbridge Island, Los Angeles, San Francisco in 1941, they were reading the newspapers. They knew what was going on with the war in the Far East and the Pacific. Were their fears well-formed, well-founded as far as what might happen to them if there were an invasion on the West Coast?
I think that they were. And if you look at the situation that occurred in every other country that Japan attacked, you'll have some understanding of what the potential was for an attack and the results of an attack on the West Coast. In the Philippines, for example, the local Japanese there, many of them were members of the Japanese military working as civilians in the country. I spoke to the wife of one of the business owners there, and she said that every one of their employees who was Japanese ended up in the Japanese army. You had similar kinds of intelligence gathering activity taking place in Malaya and Thailand, in what was called the Dutch East Indies, where you had people in place operating undercover in Panama, and some of this is related in reports and intercepts that we've gotten. Now, this business of attacking the West Coast, there's an interesting historical element to this. I think most people have heard about the Battle of Midway and how before the battle they sent out the false message that the distiller was not working, and supposedly, according to the makers of the film and others, this was done to determine whether they were talking about attacking Midway. And if you read Admiral Layton's book, and he was the head of intelligence for the Pacific Fleet, he said that's not what it was at all. He said we in the Pacific Fleet knew that it was Midway, but the people in Washington thought it was going to be the West Coast. And so we sent this out, not for us, but we sent it out to convince the people in Washington. So there was a lot of fear that there would be an attack on the West Coast. Another thing that's not known is that during the Battle of Midway, to prevent any attack on the West Coast or to get early warning, a picket line of boats was made along the west coast of the United States from Seattle all the way down to Southern California. Recreation boats and fishing boats and other things. If there was going to be an attack, they wanted to be alerted to it. So I think there was real danger.
I'd like to turn your attention to something slightly more current. The public is very aware of this particular book, Michelle Malkin's In Defense of Internment. It was published in 2004 and created quite a stir. She was examining the relocation and internment of the Japanese in World War II and comparing it to today's situation. And when I began looking at this book, I noticed that right in the very beginning, she has a dedication, and it says, "In memory of John McCloy and David Lowman, who defended America's honor to the end." And I'm wondering if, since this book was so highly visible, David Lowman's right up front, you're the editor and publisher, did you receive any phone calls or requests for interviews, anything like that at this point?
I didn't receive anything as a result of that. I would like to say a few things about Michelle Malkin. Her heritage is Filipino, and Filipino women, from my experience and from what I've heard, are very strong, stalwart people. During our captivity, during the military imprisonment in the Philippines, Filipino women helped in very courageous ways to alleviate the suffering of Americans and other Filipinos. So she comes from a tradition of being a very stalwart and strong, courageous person. She's also very bright, and she's very brave. She's not afraid to stand up for what she believes is true. And so I think she's written a very important book. When she gave a talk out in Berkeley about the book, they had hundreds of people banging on the doors and screaming and demonstrating and yelling and trying to disrupt her. People unwilling to listen, unable to bring themselves to allow someone else to give a counter view to the circumstance. And I think she did a great service. She says right up front that she's not advocating the internment of any of the Islamofascists, but she is saying that there are reasons and there are times when people have to do certain things for security reasons.
As you're thinking back about World War II and what the president chose to do with his war powers, what do you think that has to say about our situation today and what presidents have to do in time of war?
As soon as September 11th occurred, some of the first words that came out of various political and civic leaders was, "We've got to remember the Japanese. We've got to remember the Japanese." So what they were saying, I guess, was that we've got to be very careful that we don't infringe on anybody's civil rights. You still hear this. You mentioned to me that you heard Justice Breyer talking about it on C-SPAN last week. This is in the end of 2006. Justice Pryor from the 11th Circuit Court did it in an article recently. It's a touchstone for a lot of people who seem to be concerned about this, and it's a false touchstone.
Why false?
Well, Mark Levine, for example, who is a prominent political activist and attorney, has published a book on the Supreme Court, and I saw him on C-SPAN, and he said, one of the three worst Supreme Court decisions in in this country has been the Korematsu case. Said there wasn't one scintilla of evidence that a single Japanese American had ever done anything. And I thought to myself, there's 400 pages of it right there. But they don't know about it, and they're not allowed to hear about it because the opposing view is not allowed to be given. And you have that right here in Bainbridge Island. You have the superintendent of schools saying that this is beyond debate, you know, and that is such a ignorant position. We ought to say it happened, but this is how it happened, and this is why it happened, and this is what we've done, and let's move on from there. But you know, the Japanese, not talking about Japanese in America, but the Japanese in Japan have a penchant for revising their history. And every so often you read about riots in China and riots in Korea because the Japanese have put out another textbook that completely ignores World War II or completely ignores whatever they did in World War II. And people haven't forgotten that. And there's no reason why we should do this in the United States. We can admit what happened, we can talk about it, but we shouldn't be allowed to fabricate it.
One of the things that happened during this past year was that Bill Kubik passed away, which saddened many of us who'd come to know and love him for his work. Lee, I understand that just before Bill passed away, he sent you a letter. What did he say to you?
Bill knew that he was on his last days, and he told me that he hoped that I would continue the work and that he was passing the ball to me. I don't know that I'm the one exactly to do it, but when he knew he was dying, he was thinking of still bringing the truth to the American people.
And that comes with a cost. Sometimes people that stick their necks out get their heads cut off.
Well, you know, I think that's an interesting aspect of this whole business, and I'm sure you have felt it. I know you've felt it here on Bainbridge Island. But the modus operandi of the political groups behind this historical revision is very clear. If somebody says something that in the least way contradicts the approved story, they go after him tooth and tongue. Representative Howard Cobell in North Carolina made some fairly innocuous statements about the relocation and how it was helpful to the Japanese Americans in providing them security and providing them food. And the firestorm that was generated by the Asian groups led by the Japanese was unbelievable. I had read in one report that 600,000 emails went out urging people to fax and write their congressman and the leadership of the Republican Party to get Cobell removed from his committee positions. This is outrageous. I mean, this is not Nazi Germany. And the same thing happened to Dan Lundgren when he didn't vote on the commission to give money to the Japanese Americans. So you can be sure I have been called a racist. I was interviewed by National Public Radio after we sent out a press release on this Smithsonian critique. It was never broadcast, but it was a very friendly and open thing. And right at the end of the interview, the man said, now there's people who say you're a racist. Well, of course you are called a racist when they have no way of countering the objective truth of the circumstance. Then you become a racist. So that's part of the action.
Now, Lee, you are a military man.
Yes.
I understand. You mentioned earlier that you are a graduate of West Point.
You know, when I was liberated in February 3rd, 1945, it was by the first elements of the 1st Cavalry Division and the 44th Tank Battalion. And my dad had been a military man, and I thought that was the way for me. I really admired those guys. I graduated from West Point. I served 20 years in combat and intelligence assignments. I graduated from the Staff College and the War College, and I was, shortly before my retirement, I was the Intelligence Plans Officer for Terrorism in the Defense Intelligence Agency. Now, I can tell you that if I had ever come across a message from an enemy or an enemy group saying that they had people working in our aircraft plants for intelligence purposes, or they had people scoping out our harbors and reporting on our ship movements, or they had people in our army to gather information, the bells would have rung and the red flags would have gone up, and that's exactly what happened at the beginning of World War II with these magic messages.
Lee, I have so much enjoyed speaking with you, and I'm sure our audience is very much enjoying the benefit of your experience and research. When you were 3 and you were in that internment camp, can you tell us what was going through your head?
Well, I had one incident. You know, we have gotten to the point in this country where being called a name is worse than anything else in the world. And I can tell you that being hungry is worse than being called a name. And being beaten is worse than being called a name. When I was a little boy, the saying was, "Sticks and stones may hurt my bones, but names will never hurt me, break my bones." I was helping a fellow in Idaho write a book about our experiences in Camp Holmes. And he sent me a letter and he said, "I found this entry in my mother's diary for February 1942. And it said, this morning, 3-year-old Lee Allen was asked what he wanted to be when he grew up. And he said, I don't want to be a major like my dad, and I don't want to be a doctor like my mom. I want to be a Jap and live on the outside of the fence." And so I think that helps put things in perspective. I understand what it's like to be in a camp.
Lee, thank you.
Thank you, Mary.
This is Mary Victoria Dombrowski. This is War and Magic.